Okay, so you've got a few notes. Here's the official line. So we do it to aid in decision making. Otherwise, you can imagine that risk to reduce levels of risk is going to become quite a haphazard process, and it's especially if you're going to use this to defend yourself from breaches of the legislation or from legal cases, civil litigation to try to get money from your company if they don't think you've protected your employees properly. Then what you need is a formalized and suitably rigorous process. And so you want to guide your thinking through that process. To set priorities by time and budget. So again, this doesn't necessarily have to be just for health and safety. You can use it in any circumstance, but you can evaluate what presents the most significant risk, and you then can set your time scales for your work that you need to carry out, so that you're dealing with the worst things first, and then as the finance arrives and you've dealt with the you've put in place the initial and most urgent control measures, you can then move on to less urgent and then eventually aspirational measures for reducing the risk from that hazard. So where is the actual risk and the perceived risk? So it's just a note to consider that your experience in life, who you know, your upbringing, your cultural backgrounds, workplace that you're in, the opinions of others, all these things can influence your perception of risk. And so it's very important that you move beyond that to consider how likely there is to be harm from this hazard. So what is the actual risk? And so a couple of good examples might be if you are so if you consider driving a car, you consider driving a car as actually being a pretty low risk thing to do. However, I would suggest that the driving a car is the highest risk thing that you do every day in your life. Unless you're into some kind of extreme adrenaline sports, then if you look at the statistics for road accidents, especially for cyclists, if you cycle to and from work, then you'll see that actually the level of risk versus the perceived risk is very significant, because you're driving a 2-ton weight at 70 miles an hour in the presence of lots of other 2-ton weights driven by people, and people are very well known for making mistakes, and so people don't perceive driving as being particularly high risk, and so they don't pay attention properly. They try and do their makeup, they try to answer their phone, they smoke cigarettes at the wheel, they listen to loud music. All of these things are going to distract them, and so you'll sure be familiar, if you drive a car yourself, with your own shortfalls, and so you can see how perceived risk versus actual risk needs to be considered. To formalize a process of an assessment, so it gives it a pathway. It's risk assessment, and it gets it down on paper, so you have a record of it, and then a record that you can work from and progress forwards with. To aid the communication of risk, so if you've got 5 or more employees in the UK, under the management regs, you have to make a written record of your risk assessments. But interestingly, under the management regs, if you don't have 5 or more, so if you don't have 5 employees, you've still got to do the risk assessments. You just don't write them down anywhere. So it's best to write them down, so you've got something down there on paper, and then you can use it to work from. And you can spend a lot of time doing something on paper, making changes to it, pushing around ideas, and it costs you very little. And so it's much more straightforward than trying to bring in something, seeing if it works, and then trying something else, seeing if that works, and learning through trial and error. Risk is discussed with those involved, so it's highlighted. So the very process of doing the risk assessment involving the employees will highlight the level of risk to the employees from the various activities, and will hopefully get past some of these perceived risk and actual risk issues. And so you will be able to engage them within the process, which will improve the effectiveness of it. But also, if you engage the employees, improve the effectiveness of, the thoroughness of your risk assessment. Because if you come in as into a working environment, you may be an expert in risk assessment and health and safety, but you'll have no idea about how they do things in practice. And so you could be hopelessly naive in the way in which you approach the risk assessment. And so you need those employees on board as they are experts in how their particular bit of that work environment operates. What will work, what will not. So people have a say-so and they engage, they buy into the process. If you dictate to people, they rarely like it. They tend to buck against it. But if you involve them in the process and the decision making, then they buy into the process and they are more likely to engage in the control measures that you've put in place. Cooperative, it should be something which is open, transparent, and a team approach. By transparent, I mean everyone should be able to see what's going on at every stage. There should be nothing hidden. And employees should have access to the risk assessments. They should be their go-to document for working out how to do something in a safe and healthy way. And so this might be just so that they can read it if they want to, but certainly if you're in any kind of supervisory or managerial capacity, then you'll be needing to work through those risk assessments with your employees in order to bring in control measures and make sure that they are executed effectively. Risk assessments should not sit on a dusty shelf. So you might weigh up the costs and benefits. So target your resources for maximum benefits to reduce the risk. Avoid being misled by perceived risks. Legislative compliance. The management regulations require you to carry out risk assessments by law, but they are not the only regulations. And so if you go into various specific areas of health and safety, such as display screen equipment use, control of lead at work, lifting operations, lifting equipment, manual handling, COSH, control of substances hazardous to health, then each one of them have their own particular unique requirements for risk assessment approaches and the relevant regulations. So you need to work out what they are, what is required for those regulations, and then can make sure that your risk assessment covers those requirements. So a general risk assessment, like the one that I showed a few slides earlier, if you did it for manual handling for a workplace where there were, say, for instance, a dozen tasks which needed manual handling assessments doing on them, presented a higher than a background level of risk, then you would need to use a different template to the one you got there. So ask them what's the acceptable risk. So you need to decide what is acceptable. And this, again, is one that is very much on your opinion. So if I was to tell, that very much depends on the situation. So if you were to consider something that had a 1 in a million chance of causing a death, then you think, yeah, okay, that'd be an acceptable level of risk to me. But if you then brought this in on a national organisation which had 500,000 or 250,000 employees or something along those lines, one of these real giants, then you would consider that as you brought it in would be guaranteed to cause a death every 4 years, and then you need to make your decision about whether that is indeed acceptable. So that's a bit of a silly example, possibly a little flippant, but you get the general idea. You need to choose what is acceptable within the workplace, but also what is feasible within the workplace. And then you might use it to assess scientific information available. So this is where we're getting into the quantitative side of things.